I actually have quite a bit of love for the Legend of Zelda series, but I think it gets a pass on a lot of things that other games don't get a pass on. Instead of filling this journey through Zelda with negativity, I'm going to try to channel all of that negativity into this review of the Minish Cap, because the Minish Cap kind of exemplifies a lot of the problems I have with the series as a whole. It was not developed by Nintendo, it was developed by an in-house studio at Capcom, and you can tell it doesn't really fit together as well as it should, and it's kind of just this mishmash of things you know from Zelda. I went into this game expecting kind of this cult classic and to just fall in love with its charms, and it certainly has its charms, but this kind of ended up very low on my list of favorite Zelda experiences. It's notable mainly for its main gimmick, which is that you can shrink down, and then there's kind of puzzles that incorporate that where you have to switch between normal size and small size, and you can go inside of things, and it's a really cool concept. It separates this game from the rest of the series in a cool way, but it's not enough to make this a worthwhile playthrough. You are Link, you're always Link, and then Zelda comes by and I guess she's your best friend. This seems very odd given how the series usually progresses, where Zelda is kind of this royal figure and you're kind of this peasant and you have to save her. In this game, with no real context, you guys are like best friends and you go to this festival together, and then the bad guy shows up and he turns Zelda to stone. And that's basically the plot of the entire game. There's these 4 gemstones that split and they go to the 4 corners of the map, and basically your mission is to go get them back so that you can reforge your sword and you can turn Zelda back and save the land of Hyrule, I guess. During this intro, you are also introduced to Eslo, which is your hat bird man. And he's actually my favorite character in the game because he's very self-aware, very sassy, very charming. He kind of does that thing where he points out how dumb something you're doing is, which is not a good thing necessarily, because that just lets you know that the game developers knew that what you are doing is dumb. And if they knew it was dumb, why did they put it in the game? So then you're pushed off to the first dungeon, which is very basic. It's your forest temple. There's one in every Zelda game. It makes nice use of the power of the GBA, because in the center of this dungeon is this big barrel, and you can go inside the barrel and rotate it, and it looks 3D, even though it's very obviously like a giant sprite. You get the Gust Jar, which is similar to the item in Skyward Sword, the Bag of Winds, where you could clear off dust and things. You can do the same thing here. It doesn't feel as good, obviously, because you kind of just have to point in one direction and wait for it to do its thing. It's not as satisfying, but it's also used for more things than just sucking up dirt. You can use it to pull yourself across gaps. You can use it to propel yourself on lily pads. There's a lot of different uses they find for this one item, which is really cool. You're also introduced to teleportation squares, which is, as you get farther into the dungeon, there is a blue and a red square that unlock, and they teleport you back to the beginning, which is extremely handy. That's a great idea. But then you get to the first boss, and this is where my problem with the graphical style of this game comes into play, because there are parts of this game that look fantastic, and you can tell they were handcrafted by an artist. And when you go, say in Hyrule Town, there's this inn, and if you shrink down to Minish size, you can go up into the rafters, and it's this really cozy little society they have up there, and you can also see the inn down below you, and it's this really nice scene. But what they do for a lot of the enemies is that they've kind of done the thing where, like in Donkey Kong Country, you can tell this is not a hand-drawn sprite. This is like a 3D model that was made to be, it was turned into a sprite. And whenever there is movement or scaling on these creatures, you can tell that none of it is being hand-drawn, it is just being stretched by the computer. And it looks completely awful. And it clashes with the graphical style of the background, and it just completely demolishes this game's charm. And it doesn't help that this game is pulling from different styles. There's a Link to the Past in the backgrounds, but then there's enemies straight out of the Wind Waker for no reason, and those graphical styles do not match at all, and it looks just terrible. There's also areas that you can tell they didn't put as much work into because they're just very few colors, very repetitive with the tiling of the textures, and then you compare that to areas where they obviously put a lot of work in, and it feels very disconnected. This is probably the ugliest Zelda game I've played, which is so weird because it has, ideally so much charm coming from these characters, at the end of the day, it just doesn't gel into something as appreciable as like the Wind Waker. But then you get your stone, and then you go to the mountain, and that's where my problems with the gameplay start to pop up, because there is a moment in the section where you need to take this green, it's like mineral water, and you need to pour it onto this bean, because as the game has taught you, you have to pour the liquid onto the bean. Before this point, there were blue beans, and you had to pour water on them. And they're like, you can't do that with the green beans, you got to use the mineral water. So you go get the mineral water, and then you have to shrink down and walk up to this giant bean. And this is where the game's logic just erases itself. Because what you actually need to do is lift this bean up and carry it out as small Link, which makes absolutely no sense. Because as the game has taught you, you just need to pour the liquid onto the bean. So the first thing 99% of people are going to do is walk up to this bean, pour out the thing, and then nothing's going to happen. And then because it's not designed well, and because they didn't seem to anticipate that this is what people would do, you have to go back out and go get the mineral water again, which is not near to where you are. You have to go back a couple screens to this mineral water, grab it, and come back. And even at that point, most people are going to be clueless as to how to progress. This is extremely frustrating, especially because up to this point, the game did not explain to you that Link could lift things as, tiny Link. There's no, logical reason why he should be able to lift this giant bean. And it's even worse because about 3/4 of the way through the game, you get an item that lets little Link lift heavy items or push heavy items. At this point in the game, you don't have that item. You don't even know that item exists, but the game still expects you to lift this giant bean and carry it out of the screen. And it makes no sense. Parts of this game seem like they were designed to sell walkthroughs to children, and I'm sure it worked. So thanks a lot, Capcom. Okay, but then you get to the second dungeon, which is kind of cool because you get this cane, which lets you flip things. But it also lets you, if you shoot it into like a hole, you can get in the hole and then pop out and you'll go up a floor. So there's these items with multiple uses that they put to good use in the dungeons. There's also all these minecarts running through the dungeon. These are a ton of fun to ride, and they do this really cool thing where they take you past screens that you can't get to yet, so it kind of gets the puzzle and gears rolling in your head, and there'll be a piece of heart, and you're like, I gotta get that piece of heart for no real reason. But you do, and it's fun. But this also introduces kind of one of the worst systems in the game, which is that you can jump into whirlwinds, and then Ezlo kind of pops out like a parachute, and you can float around. And where this should be this majestic thing where you can kind of fly through there, instead it feels super kludgy, and you don't have a really good sense of how far you are off the ground. Because they put whirlwinds in places where you don't really need them, and they don't put them in places where you kind of do need them. So it feels like this guessing game. This isn't a great concept. You're just kind of moving slowly to the next whirlwind over and over, and they bring this back up again and again in the game. It just never gets more challenging or more interesting. It's just kind of this concept. After you complete this dungeon, you get the second stone, which means you can start to reforge your sword. At this point, the game introduces another concept, which is where you can split Link into multiple people using specific squares on the ground. So if there's a block that needs 2 people to push it, you can turn it to 2 Links and then push it and then revert back to 1. And at this point in the game, they don't do a ton with that, but as you unlock more stones, you get more copies you can make. And by the end of the game, they're actually doing a lot of cool things with this concept. Here, they're just kind of introducing it to you. And then you hit another roadblock, which is to get to the swamp, which is the third stone, you need to get the Pegasus boots. And in order to do that, you have to go through kind of this fetch quest. And this fetch quest is frustrating for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons that kind of keeps cropping back up with this game is you can't begin it until certain things happen. So you can go hang out with the shoemaker and talk to him and do all these things, but until you do the one specific thing the game wants you to do, you won't be able to progress this quest any further. Because eventually, when you go back to the shoemaker, he falls asleep, and they're like, oh, you gotta go get the mushroom from the witch, so then you gotta go get the mushroom from the witch, you gotta bring it back, and then you gotta talk to Minish, and then blah 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 blah, get your Pegasus boots. And it should be this cool thing, but instead it just feels like you're clicking off like you can see the game's hierarchy of code, where has talked to blah. Yes, no, true, false. And then you have to keep going. And it just kind of feels like you are guessing at what the game wants you to do until you finally hit it. And then you can move on. Not satisfying in any way. And it's kind of a preview of what's to come, which is like the worst thing ever, but I'll get there in just a sec. The swamp is kind of interesting in that it's not very obvious what you need to do. It's kind of, which is what a swamp should be. So that's cool, because it feels like you're just getting lost in this murky swamp, and they do a really good job of portraying that on a small screen. At this point, you have to solve another puzzle that doesn't make any sense. One of the mechanics that is kind of put on the back burner until this point in the game is that you can collect these kinstones and fuse them with characters. And this system isn't designed well because you don't have a good grasp of who you've fused with. You don't have a good grasp of if you have the kinstone you need before you talk to them. It would be awesome if before you press the button that makes you go to the screen and everything, it just told you that you don't have it. The way you get kinstones is very random. It seems like you can get them from enemies sometimes. Sometimes they're in chests. Sometimes there's no good way to know how to get the kinstone you need to talk to a specific person. It just kind of happens by happenstance. So in this section, and the reason you're fusing kinstones with people is because it makes something happen in the world, like a chest appears, or you can get to a place you couldn't get before, or a character has a new dialogue option, or something like that. And that's cool. That's a cool idea. They just don't implement it well or do much with it. So yeah, at this point there's these 3 statues, and what you need to do is not use any of the items you've gained so far, or any of your abilities. It's go up to one of them and fuse kinstones with them, and then you fuse kinstones with the statues, and then you can get through. Which is like, would have been okay if there was any indication that's what you needed to do, or any indication why that makes sense. Because up until now, you've just been talking to people and fusing kinstones with them. All of a sudden, you can fuse kinstones with anything. And the rest of the game, you kind of do that. Like at one point, you fuse with a wall, or you fuse with a cloud. So it's a bonkers system, I guess. I don't know. It's not explained well. The dungeon is like my least favorite dungeon in the game. It's very tedious. There's this item you get where you can dig through walls, which isn't fun. Like, I don't want to dig through walls. It's slow, and it's just like, I know what's on the other side of this wall, so I just have to sit here and dig through it until I get there. The boss is super easy, and then at the end, they don't even give you the stone. They're like, hey, hold on, you can't have the stone yet. You gotta go do this other crap. And then the other crap is like the worst thing ever. This is that thing I was talking about. You have to go talk to the little people are called Pickery. There's a Pickery, like, librarian, and he's in the library. And you can't talk to him because there's 3 library books missing. But you don't really know that. And you don't really know how to get these books. And sometimes the books aren't where they should be. But after you do all these arbitrary things to get this quest moving, eventually you can kind of follow these extremely vague hints to go get these 3 books for very tenuous reasons. So you can climb up his little link and talk to this librarian guy, and then he opens the door to the dungeon, I guess. And this is just like madness. This whole section is like, I did look up a walkthrough at one point, and even then I was just like, what is even happening here? And it's ridiculous. This is a bad part of the game. This is probably one of the worst parts in any Zelda game I've played, just because it's so, even at its very best, even at its ideal, if you're doing everything you're asked to, all you're doing is returning people's library books. And there's nothing fun about that. And it takes like an hour to an hour and a half. Like, obviously they realized this game was way too short because there's only like 4 or 5 dungeons, so let's just put in this giant fetch quest in the middle. And it's garbage, and this game is garbage, and I hate this game. And then you go to the ice dungeon, which is super simple and super short. They do the thing where you have to like push the ice blocks, and then they slide until they hit something, and you have to do that to like flip switches, which obviously has been in every video game ever. It was in Pokemon. What they don't do, and what they should do, is give you some sort of boots for traction so that you can actually feel like you're moving blocks the way you want to, because as it is, you kind of slip and slide around on the ice, and that's a really bad way to set up one of these puzzles, because you're being asked to do a very specific sequence of movements, and if you can't really control your character, that becomes very unenjoyable. And it's not very enjoyable to start with, so there you go. The boss is kind of cool, but again, it's using these sprite techniques where it looks like complete garbage. If they had just they had just drawn these sprites like to be big instead of like taking a sprite and blowing it up, this would have looked so much nicer. I guess there's computational power questions in that. You know, it takes a lot more work, but this is not an acceptable substitute. From here, you go to the graveyard where you meet the guy from Ocarina of Time, because everybody is in this game. He gives you a key, you walk outside, a crow comes by, steals the key, you have to go get the key from the crow. What? It's still like the game is just like wasting your time at this point. It's dumb. And then you go to the clouds, I guess. There's a mansion in the clouds and you gotta go help these kids in the clouds by floating around on the whirlwinds and digging through clouds. Like, the game kind of refuses to make any sense. And then finally there's another dungeon to get the stone that you already beat the dungeon to get, and it's the same concept as the last dungeon, but now it's harder and longer and more tedious. And it starts to ramp things up because now you can split into 3 links, which is a cool idea. There's more puzzles you can do with that where you kind of need to be in formations and avoid enemies. That stuff's cool. The rest of the dungeon is not, because the combat in these 2D Zelda games is not interesting in any way. You're just blocking attacks and then swinging. That gets even worse right before the end of the game. Again, I'll talk about that, but that boss fight in this dungeon is actually really cool. You're floating on the back of giant sky manta rays and stabbing them in the eyes in formation, and that's really cool. More ideas like that would have helped. And then you have all the things and you reforge your sword, but then, oh no, the bad guy comes back and he transforms Hyrule Castle into the last dungeon. This dungeon is really uninteresting from a visual perspective. There's some interesting puzzles going on, but then towards the end of the dungeon, the puzzle is you need to unlock 4 little blocks, and each key is guarded by these enemies, and all these enemies are exactly the same. They're like the Dark Nuts or whatever. But the combat is not like varied or interesting enough to make this meaningful, because all you're doing is fighting the same enemy over and over and over and over and over again in like 12 different rooms to get these 4 keys so you can move a block. Like, at this point, the concept of Zelda games just starts to like break down, where how is this at all interesting or fun? It's really not. And then you have to get to the last boss, Bati, and he's gone insane with power. And there's this interesting concept here, which isn't explained well, and it kind of sucks, where he's like, the bell will chime 3 times, and on the 3rd chime, I will have all the power. So you have to fight to him, and each time you go through a room, it's like the bell rings once. So by the time you get to the last room, it's like, I need to get to him before this bell rings. But then what it does is it throws 3 shielded enemies at you that you have to fight through. And I was fighting them, and I was fighting them, and I was fighting them, and then all of a sudden it's like, ding. And it's like, oh, game over. So now you have to do it again. And that's cool, because they explained that would happen. So I guess it's on me, right? But it's like extremely frustrating because you don't have any concept of how soon it's going to chime. And it doesn't chime in time with the other 2 chimes. So it's just like, I guess I just have to fight as quickly as I can against these enemies that I just fought 12 of, and they're not that interesting, but now there's 3 of them in a room. And then you get to the last boss, and it's very not Zelda-like as boss, because it's like this demon that's shooting lasers out of eyes at you. And at this point, you're asked to basically hone all the skills you've used separating the links to kind of fight this boss, and it's not that interesting. It's kind of difficult until you figure out what to do, and then there's one final boss encounter, and then you beat the game, and then there is like no ending whatsoever. Your hat turns it back into a dude, and he's like, thanks man, that was really cool. And then he gives you a hat, and that would be cool, except it was already established that Link has a hat, even in the chronology of the series. So that's not that interesting. It's like, obviously Link has a hat. And then roll credits.